It's really a delight to welcome Maurice Mitchell to Madison as our latest visiting scholar. I've known of Maurice. I don't really know Maurice personally, particularly well at all, but I've known of him for years now, going back to, 2015 when he was, at the convention, basically founded the movement for Black Lives. He's done an incredible range of things in his relatively young life so far. He was a student activist at Howard and became prominent there. Then he went to New York. He ran the Civic Roundtable or Civic Engagement Table, for years. And then when Michael Brown got killed, he went down, he just decamped to Ferguson, Missouri. He moved there and was very, very active in all of that and all that has followed. He co-founded and led for years Blackbird, which was a forum in many ways to Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives. And then since 2018, and this is when I really started paying attention to him, he took over as the national director of the Working Families Party, which is the lineal descendant of the new party that Danny Cantor founded way back in 1990. And there he's become almost cheerfully infamous for observing that the right is really dangerous and the left is really annoying. In various ways has tried to, in the gentlest but firmest way possible, to bring some sense to the often almost insanely self-referential movement of all these people out here who want to reclaim the country and save us often from ourselves. But in that leadership position, he's been not just in the business of mobilizing resentments and bias and complaints, but also trying to put together a sort of positive alternative, something positive as well as opposition. That's very, very hard work to do, especially in America with this incredibly business-dominated political system, and especially given the almost vociferously disorganized character of social movements here. So for his wisdom and courage and whatever, welcome, Maurice.
Okay. So where do I begin? Yeah, that's right. I often say that right, especially the version of the right that has chosen to focus primarily on governance in the United States and have captured the Republican Party. They are dangerous, and they're very explicit about it. And we should not be coy. We should be very clear about the real threat. And I think it's important that we don't both sides, the right and the left, unless being annoyed to actually physically be annoyed to that. You don't have to worry in the same way about some of the excesses on the left as we do about the excesses on the right. But for organizing a bigger we certainly need to focus on some of the challenges on the political left. And I wrote an article called Building Resilient Organizations that tries to take some of those things head on. I won't be referencing that. And I know I'm in a university, but I'm not going to be referencing Foucault or Marx or Gramsci or Chomsky. What I'm going to do for most of my time is reference the experiences that I've had the privilege of having with working people, and from my assessment, the condition of working people, the emotional conditions of working people, because ultimately we're human beings. we build human systems. There's no way to escape the emotionality of everything that we do, including our politics. And I think that a politics that centers on the urgent anxieties and frustrations of working people is one that could be irresistible for working people. That politics doesn't necessarily need to take the form of many of the left ideals that I believe in. That could be a rightward politics, which is why I think the interventions need to come from the left. So that's, if that's okay with you, that's what I'd like to spend most of my time talking about. So you can't turn on the news today, laptop, your tablet, your cell phone without getting some pretty hard and harsh news. Some of you might even have turned off notifications so that you don't get the breaking news, right? I could identify with that. I can't deal with the anxiety loop, so I've kind of shut those things off. To me, we have so many intersecting crises that so many are feeling, from the student debt crisis that kept many of my peers, like I went to college in the late 90s, so many of my peers have dealt with the fact that we deal with so much debt just from going to college that limits our abilities to raise families, to start families, to grow families, to build businesses, to buy homes. As of last year, the average student debt amount coming out of a 4-year public college is north of $32,000, and the number only continues to climb. And if you want an advanced degree, you're talking about 6 digits possibly. Our concerns are overlapping. So that feeling of economic insecurity, that lingers a lot for us, but then it's also combined with this existential dread many of us are feeling about our ability to continue to, for the planet to continue to host human life, right? And we have certain parts of the globe that are in droughts, other places that are on fire. The climate crisis is very real. It's very real to me. During Superstorm Sandy, my home was destroyed. My family and myself, we were homeless. I ended up living in hotels for months. So this idea that climate crisis is coming, it's here, and it's here for more and more people, especially more and more working people. And, I've often dreamt after that about a world where the impacts of natural disasters and were less catastrophic and they weren't regular annual occurrences. And even if they were, that they were caused for some sort of global effort to protect our species. Now, if it's economy or climate, it might just be violence, just the pure dread about facing violence that many of us feel, from the local to the international violence. For more than 100 days, we've watched in real time as tens of thousands of people have been bombed, starved, and forced from their homes in Gaza. War in Sudan that's displaced millions and killed thousands. People in the Congo are displaced and dispossessed by the global hunger for extraction of raw resources. There's heightened tensions in Yemen, in Iran, and recently in Jordan. Russia's continued assault in Ukraine. So no matter what positions you're forming in relation to all these conflicts, the visuals and the stories are harrowing, and it's near impossible to be human and not feel anything. At home, we have a crisis of gun violence, and while people debate the impact of crime and violence, a constant barrage of news, if it bleeds, it leads, that could leave us all feeling unsafe. Even if statistically we're not in any way part of the violence, the atmosphere of violence in our media and our general feelings of insecurity create, for a lot of us, a sense of deep sort of dispossession that we can't easily get our hands around. If it's not the economy, the climate, or violence, sometimes we aren't even safe in our own bodies. Abortion rights are being stripped, which means women that suffer miscarriages at home are facing possible jail time. And more about our very bodies, our hearts and our minds feel more and more colonized. The devices that we use and the algorithms that seek to colonize our attention and our intentions. Um, and somehow we have access to more and more information, but feel less and less connected. And it's been well documented that reports of increasingly at younger ages, people are experiencing depression, anxiety, a sense of hopelessness and fear for the future, and deep loneliness. I could personally identify with this. I observe it, I see it in the field. I'm on the road. I talk to people all the time, and I personally feel this. Last spring, the Surgeon General called the rise of loneliness, disconnection, and isolation a public health crisis. Despite being more technically connected, right? Like on Instagram, I have like thousands of followers. It's hard to even understand what that means, right? And despite having more access to information, like I know what people that I went to high school, I know that they had a great dinner and they took a picture of it, went to Cabo. Despite all of that, there's this feeling that more of us can't necessarily get a hold of. Something isn't exactly right. We find ourselves more polarized, more fragmented, further away from each other, probably than any other time in our national experience. You may be wondering why the head of a political party is spending so much time talking about connection and mental health. And the answer is simple. What vexes us, what ails us, what hurts us, the most intimate questions we face, the deepest questions our society face, are actually being held prisoner by our politics. In fact, our politics exacerbate these problems. So we need a new set of politics that puts at its center our deep longing for connection, meaning, and belonging. And I speak from a place of experience. Despite all the contact I have with people every day, virtually and in person, I'm not immune from the clutches of anxiety and depressive moments. I think my experience might be instructive. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to get personal. Okay. So Joel, you mentioned the fact that I organize in the movement for Black Lives. So I remember it probably was 2015. One of the high watermarks in 2015 for organizing was organizing the movement for Black Lives convening in Cleveland. And as an organizer, I should have felt like self-realized. And I couldn't understand why I felt this sense of hollowness. And after that moment, I found myself feeling more and more in the clutches of anxiety. I don't know if anybody's actually felt anxiety, true anxiety, but it feels really painful. And it's almost like your brain is conspiring against you and is giving you compelling reasons to think that you're completely isolated. And I remember struggling to get out of bed. And my partner at the time really pushed me to go to the grocery store. And I was looking at this display. I lived in Southern California at the time. So Southern California, excellent produce, like the best avocados you could ever use. And so there's this display of avocados. And for some reason, I was just overwhelmed by the variety of avocados, I just snapped. I ran into our car, I locked the door, started crying. So I couldn't necessarily explain the emotions I was feeling, but I picked up the phone. I called my older brother, and whenever I call him, it often goes to voicemail. But for whatever reason, that time he picked up immediately, and we're talking, and we're kind of going through the niceties, and eventually, he asked me how I'm doing, and this was the first time I told the truth about how I was actually feeling, and so I shared with him very vulnerably how I was feeling, and he took a pause and he said, "Of course," which was like the perfect thing to say. Because I didn't need somebody to like try to like psychoanalyze me or tell me everything was going to be okay. Really needed somebody to bear witness to what I was going. witness to my suffering. And when I talk to folks, when I talk to everyday workers, people like my cousins who might work in the service industry, or when I'm on the strike lines, like the UAW strike line, which I'll talk more about, those workers, thing that I notice, the people are very different. But the one thing that I notice is that so many people feel as though they're invisible, that they have deep sufferings, deep longings, that our society, that elites, that our political leaders, that the institutions used to simply bear witness to. People don't necessarily need the magic bullet that's going to solve everything. But people fundamentally are looking for a healing balm, knowing that their condition is not necessarily a product of their lack of work, but their condition is a product of something much bigger that we're all wrestling. When my brother said, "Of course," I heard that. There's nothing wrong with you. Of course, in this crazy world, you're feeling this sense of anxiety, and it's going to be okay. So I want a politics that could do that at the scale of society. I feel that a politics that could communicate to everyday working people that they could believe their eyes and ears. It's a politics that could rebuild the connections that have been broken by 40 years of neoliberalism and particular policy decisions that have created this sense of anxiety. So the topic, the title that I chose is "What If We Save Us?" Right? And that is the methodology that I believe can create that sort of politics. And I want to lean into that. For all of our lives and the lives of our parents and their parents, we've been trained to look up to the quote unquote elite. There's a pretty rigid caste system in this country and in other countries. It's pretty intense. There's a few thousand billionaires, and there's billions of people. It's just a few thousand of them. They live like gods. And we've been instructed in explicit and implicit ways that we shall look up to these people. People who got their status from their place in our caste system based on the wealth they acquired or inherited, where they went to school, a family name, the power they or their ancestors were able to acquire, or some combination of the four. And we've been trained to hand over control of our bodies, our community, state, and national affairs to these folks. We were told that if we did this, we'd be taken care of. We were told that in explicit and implicit ways that everything would be all right, and that if we just went to school, got good grades, graduated, got a good job, and accepted that there were adults smarter, wiser, and almost genetically engineered to lead us, that we should relinquish every other concern to, that we'd get our piece of the American dream and that we'd be taken care of. I don't know if you've ever heard this it's very popular Christian aphorism, let go and let God, right? In some way, it's let go and let Gates, or let go and let Page, or in Elon we trust, or Bezos knows best, right? Focus on being a hard worker and a law-abiding citizen, and let us take the wheel. We got this. And I need to look no further than the state of our nation and the state of our emotional conditions to know that without reservation, we were lied to. These are myths. And it brings me back to this question of what if we saved us? What if, instead of looking up at the elites, we looked towards one another? What if we looked to our peers, to our neighbors, and to our community for solutions and for solace? And I'm suggesting that this is both necessary, but I'm also recognizing that it's super challenging. But it's essential, because the people we outsourced our care and well-being to are not invested and aren't very good at it. So what would it look like if, instead of falling into despair, we insisted on connection? Because those same people those same people that have all the access, have all the money, are okay with you falling into disconnection and despair, because in that space, it allows for the status quo to continue, to concretize the power that they already have and build on it. They want nothing more really than that, because they get more of the pie if we aren't in any way engaging in this question of why are we even baking a pie? Right? Like, are there other ways of thinking about being able to nourish each other? So instead of doing that, what if we all got together and no longer allowed quote unquote elites to take the wheel? Because every time, again and again, they've taken the wheel, they drive us into a crisis. They drive us into subprime mortgage crises, climate crisis, opioid crisis, economic crisis after economic crisis. So we can no longer assume that there's somebody else who's going to save us, that there's somebody who's smarter, wiser, who's somehow at the wheel, who's going to be the genius business leader or elite politician that will figure out the answer, or online guru who will come up with a daily regimen to cure aching hearts. Like I get all this stuff on my feed on social media, these online gurus who like their answer to everything is wake up earlier. That is fundamentally the root problem of all of our ailings. Now, if we could look towards each other and build a movement that embraces one another across difference, what's available to us? It's not going to happen overnight or inevitably, but it can happen if we choose it. So let's go a little bit deeper here, because connection, solidarity is essential, yet direction is also critical. And I want to explain what I mean there. Across the spectrum, across ideology, across politics, a lot of people who believe that something is wrong. That deep, inescapable, undefined feeling of isolation and alienation. People around the world are feeling a deep appreciation of economic and physical insecurity and a feeling of stolen or a lack of dignity. The right wing globally is organizing around this problem, and some of them are organizing really well around this problem. One thing that fascist, ethno-nationalists, people on the far right, dictators, want to be strong men, one of the things that they do well is they tell a compelling story about how we got here. Ironically, movements that seek to divide us also do their fair share of drawing connections, of building solidarity. I actually think they do a decent job. They're not perfect, but they do a decent job at saying, hey, you, yes, you, how are you feeling? What is that you feel inside? Whatever it is, I want to tell you that you believe your eyes and ears. There's nothing wrong with you. The system is rigged against you. And then they go on and tell a story about how it happened. The right wing have a simple, albeit distorted message. They say a set of elites rigged the game and stole it from you. They often people their elite specifically with, no offense to the people in this room, but leftists and liberal academics, scientists, out of touch liberals, the woke mob, the globalists. These elites, these globalists, these out of touch liberals, they stole your dignity from you. They gave what was entitled to you away. They gave it to the other. People of color, if you're white, women, if you're a man, trans folks, if you're cisgender, immigrants, if you're native born, those people on welfare. It's a very, very compelling narrative. It's a totalizing story that helps explain so many things. That feeling of alienation, that feeling of stolen dignity, who actually stole it, where the dignity went, how you could reclaim it. So what they've done is they built a solidarity on division. White nationalism is often described as a hate movement, but white Christian nationalism at its core is a solidarity movement. I would argue that the solidarity of whiteness is probably the strongest solidarity movement in It ultimately is a solidarity that requires building an identity on dehumanizing and demanding cruelty against an invented other. But it is solidarity. Their goal is to woo working people into a sense of saving yourself and taking your anger and frustration out on another. They promise you a restoration of your dignity through meting out cruelty against another. And by the way, they say, give us the levers of government and we'll use these mighty tools to crush those that aren't like us. And in doing so, reaffirming our identity, reaffirming our dignity. It is the redistribution of cruelty. This is why we're getting book bans. We're getting draconian laws eliminating a pregnant person's right to abortion and reproductive care, and a full war on all things deemed war, which is an ill-defined catchment to hold any number of anxieties held against a world that is rapidly changing. This is one approach, one answer to the deep feelings of alienation we have. Find your crew, click up, and bang against your opposition. There is story after story of legislatures proposing bills that cut ties with organizations that they deem woke or trying to dismantle DEI efforts. At the same time, we're experiencing climate change, where working people are struggling to make ends meet. When these right-wing movements, both here and around the globe, when they get governing power, they don't deal with the economic anxiety. They often deal with the psychic anxiety and healing it through cruelty. And I think it's important that we wrestle with this and take this seriously. There is something healing about clicking up and being in an in-group and defining the out-group. There is something connecting about that. That is a form of solidarity. That is an answer. In this moment of disempowerment, dispossession, and alienation, people are seeking power, a sense of power, a sense of liberty. So I talked a little bit about their version of solidarity versus our version of solidarity and why definitions matter and why direction matters. I also want to talk about inside of their version of solidarity that they often use the word freedom, right? And I want to unpack and define that. We have a right wing or a neo-fascist version of freedom, which says you should be free to say whatever you want about anybody or any marginalized community, any invented other. Feel free to make claims that could be imagined or real about history. Free to target any number of relatively disempowered groups like trans children, for example, or target any number of sort of Baroque frustrations like attacks on drag shows, or the freedom to consume, the freedom to buy as many guns as you want. This is one definition of freedom. Oh, we should take it seriously. It's a definition of freedom that is salient to a lot of people. And it's a freedom that I think puts at the core this ethos of affirming your identity through cruelty and affirming your identity through this idea that there is some sort of individual rights that makes you whole. Now, I believe in crafting a different version of freedom. I want to talk about a positive freedom that says everyone, regardless of your zip code or where you come from, should have the right to do more than just make ends meet. You should have the freedom to thrive, to dream, to achieve, not just make basic needs, although those should be met, to love the persons that you want to love, to make your decisions about expanding your family, educating your children, or the identities that give you meaning. Furthermore, such a version of freedom isn't exclusively about individual liberties. This version rests fundamentally on collective rights, shared trust, like the collective right to organize, our collective responsibility, for example, to eradicate poverty, because there is no freedom in poverty, and it cannot be eradicated by personal responsibility solely, by waking up earlier. It could only be undone through investing in the common good. I appreciate this version of freedom, and I hope you see some value in it. This is why defining our terms matters. Because our version of freedom does something the right wing, neo fascist, ethno nationalist version of freedom does not and cannot. It recognizes the worth and dignity of every person. And not because you're in the in group, but because you have purchase on humanity. I want to be part of a movement that says, I insist on your dignity, or that your children don't go to sleep with empty stomachs, even if you disagree with me or have a different party affiliation or philosophy or identity. Another thing, this version speaks to the approach of gaining and protecting these freedoms, not through your decisions as an individual consumer in the political marketplace, a sort of neoliberal conception of politics, but through our collective action. And I'll tell you this, this type of freedom through collective action doesn't mandate that you understand or even accept every part of someone's experience or identity in order to act in solidarity with that person. You don't have to feel that you need to know everything or to be comfortable with every aspect of a person or a community to be in coalition with people or to be in motion and to be in learning. One of the red herring arguments that many folks, a lot of chaos agents on the right, and even some liberals suggest is that in order to be in motion and to be in solidarity, you need to be an expert on somebody's struggle, identity, community. And it creates a very, very high bar for collective action. You know, I hear these things, I hear these bad faith arguments or these conversations and seemingly sort of sensorial and philosophical conversations and about gender pronouns and debating the science as it relates to gender affirming care, or debates about pronouns. And we might talk or we'll argue about the appropriateness of a handful of trans athletes competing in school sports. The International Chess Federation gave us a new sort of wrinkle in this debate. They banned trans women from competing in women's chess tournaments. Thank God we handled that. That great national concern of competitive chess and the gender politics of competitive chess, right? So there's a seemingly infinite loop of these conversations started under the guise of we're just asking questions, right? And none of those false debates shrouded in the legitimacy of faux philosophical inquiry or breathless concern for the rights of children get to the core of problems facing most workers, most families, most children. Nor do they get to the key truths at the core of this sort of breaking social contract that I spoke of at the top of this talk. Nothing you do to transform your panic and anxiety about gender identity, for example, into public policy will fill the hole in our collective heart that seeks connection. The hole opened up by at least 4 decades of policy choices that robbed many communities of strong economic bases, like NAFTA, for example, or made it harder for many people to build solidarity with others. This is a local example, like the policy decisions made by your former governor, Scott Walker, to make it much harder for people in workplaces to build solidarity. Causing suffering to the few will not heal the loss of connection of the many. What I've learned is the opposite about my discomfort and my prejudices. You know, I have them, we all have them, but they ultimately aren't limiting factors to us building relationships with others. We talk about our prejudices and we talk about ourselves like we're just sort of stuck in amber. But, you know, it's very human. It is fundamentally human to prejudge. And it's ultimately our job to acknowledge them and stay in action. Because ultimately, I don't need to understand you or your identity. And I don't necessarily need you to understand me or mine for us to care deeply about our shared humanity. I don't need to gatekeep my solidarity contingent on me deciding that the things you feel deeply inside are valuable. I'm 44 years old and the father of a young child. Organizing, I've been to just about every state in this country, several countries around the world, interacting with tens of thousands of people. But as many people as I interact with, I'm wise enough to know that I don't know everything about the human experience. Although my son might disagree with that assessment. You know, you could be confused about a whole range of things, including things that make perfect sense. I could be totally confused about the things that seem commonplace to every one of you, and I can still choose to fight for your rights. I could still choose to fight for your dignity. I could still choose to understand that even though what you just said makes no sense to me, I could relate to the fact that you feel it deeply the way I feel things deeply. That's actually enough. I could be confused about the language you use, and I frequently am confused about the language that people much younger than me use. And I'm sure that there are some faculty and staff that can relate to that when they're engaging with their students. I could not be fluent in Spanish, for example, and still know that a migrant worker that is monolingual Spanish deserves dignity. I don't need to learn Spanish to figure that out. I don't need to understand what it feels like to not have your assigned gender match how you feel inside. I don't need to actually understand that. I could be deeply confused by that, but still recognize that transgender people are human beings. This idea that we need to be experts in people's experiences somehow, that we need to be sleuths, or we need to somehow be detectives in order to learn some sort of truth that unlocks our capacity to feel compassion for people, I think is a recipe for deeper disconnection. We know enough information to identify with the human condition across difference. We should trust our instincts there. And when we come together across difference for a common person, I do believe that there's something transformative that happens. Something equally transformative, like the thing that happened when I was afraid of those avocados in that car and I picked up the phone and spoke to my brother. So last year, we saw labor union after labor union win historic victories, writers and actors in Hollywood, UPS workers. Right now, we're seeing call center workers in the South organize. We're seeing university faculty organize. One of the biggest labor victories of this period was won by the United Auto Workers. They won a record contract from the Big Three. I got a chance to visit a strike line last year, and it was there where I got another glimpse of solidarity and collective action. And I want to kind of tell this story because I think it gives some color to what I'm talking about. So I go to a strike line in Toledo, Ohio, at a Jeep plant. It's like the largest Jeep plant. And I got to tour that strike line with the local UAW president. And one thing about labor unions that I think are beautiful is that you're organizing a workplace, and who ends up at a particular job site, it isn't completely random, but ultimately, what the decision to work at a particular line next to somebody is ultimately the HR managers. The HR manager said, "Yeah, you're hired. Yes, you're hired." And so what it means is at the strike line, I spoke to a young Black woman in her 30s who had worked at that plant for 4 years and was striking in order to support non-union workers who she worked right next to. I spoke to an older white man who had a lot of protections, but was striking for younger workers like her that didn't have the same protections. And he was wearing like a right-wing t-shirt. I spoke to so many people across difference. And what I could imagine is that day one, on the strike line, there must have been some interesting feelings and emotions and maybe discomfort about bringing everybody together across all that difference: race, gender, class, age, politics, and you're all on the strike line together. But I got there like week 3. People were hanging out, they were tailgating, they were cooking for each other, they were bringing baked goods from each other's homes. Solidarity was happening across difference and across vast difference in ways that if you watch the news, you would assume like our country is just so divided. There's no way that a white worker in his mid 50s that's clearly like hardcore right wing would have anything to do with like a queer presenting young Black worker in their 30s. Like, there's no way that those people would actually enjoy each other's company, relate to each other, be in solidarity, care about each other's children, wake up early to bake food for each other. But that's what was happening at this UAW strike line. And to me, that brings me back to those elites we talked about. People like Mary Barra, Stanford educated CEO of GM, the Stanford educated CEO of Chrysler. We were told that there were people who were smarter, more talented, and richer that would somehow take care of us. They sent their kids to the best schools so their heirs could take up the mantle of power. And what happened when those alleged elites took the wheel of business and government? Like I said, they drove us into a ditch. They drove us further into crisis, or they robbed from us and had us pointed to one another once we realized we were taken in. See it slightly better off workers ridiculing service sector workers. That's how you will actually see this misdirection. Or non-union workers angered because union truck drivers won historic benefits. That's how it materially plays out. Nobody's asking big questions about the people who have multi-million-dollar sort of parachutes when they fail their companies. We're focused on like, how does one worker, make $15 versus another worker? And what I saw there was these elite CEOs with the best comm strategy and the best sort of legal strategy get taken by thousands and thousands of workers with a compelling organizing strategy and this solidarity that was emerging, that was infectious, that I felt. And we're at a juncture where the cloak of elite superiority is becoming undone, where the emperor has no clothes. Those victories prove elites are not all-knowing, all-seeing, all-wise, and invincible, rather. We are learning that the stories that prop up their power are myths, that many people matriculated into elite schools, for example, through bribery, signed as donations, or through legacy because they happen to have a parent or grandparent who attended. The myth crumbles because, we saw how in the COVID pandemic, how all of the myths around our elites, around the institutions that were supposed to be rock solid and resilient, why they cracked, why they crumbled. And it creates an opening where popularly there's a crisis of legitimacy. People are asking fundamental questions about these systems that we're told were supposed to somehow save us, but practically didn't during COVID, where more than 1 million Americans and millions of other people around the world died. So, we have Theranos, we have WeWork, we have, you name it, countless examples of elites, the basic premises of capitalism, all these other things just coming undone before our eyes in a very, very popular way. So I do believe it's time that we take the wheel. It's time for everyday working people to do the driving. It's time that we saved up. We see little shoots, little examples like the worker solidarity on that strike line of everyday people taking the wheel and the results of that. We are closest to the crisis and we are closest to the solutions. Ayanna Pressley famously says, those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And look what happens when we save us and wield our collective power. Labor victory after labor victory that they actually develop and deliver these and secure tangible results for workers, but also do this other thing, begin to heal that sense of deep alienation, disconnection, loneliness. That strike lines a party. That strike line acquainted people deeply in a spiritual way with one another, connected people, hopefully through that victory in a sustained way. Not only is it a balm to that spiritual and emotional crisis, that organizing is a concrete solution to the material crisis that everyday work people feel. So this is what it looks like when we shift our gaze from the imagined horizon of the American dream towards the real brilliance and possibility of the American reality before us, which is one another. When we save us, because we can't risk one more moment of entrusting our lives and security to a violently mediocre global elite. That is no longer about just getting by. The idea that we could chance our very existence on elite benevolence after this track record of cyclical crisis is lunacy. So that's the story we need to tell and the mission we need to live. This isn't about choosing one elite over another, a right-wing, well-educated fascist over a neoliberal elite, one oligarch over another. Our story is fundamentally about changing power relations. And our story is that the future solutions for mankind is not a fascist dystopia, nor this managed neoliberal sort of status quo. We reject both. There should be no more oligarchs. And we reject a version of our movement where we don the clothing and use the language of some left simply to dunk on and ridicule other working people who, although we may disagree with, simply found a home in a place where someone was willing to bear witness to their suffering. Our story is a deep embrace of our differences, the agency and brilliance of everyday people, especially people we disagree with. Because dressing and talking like a leftist or a liberal or a progressive, yet sharpening divisions between working people only serves the politics of divisions. And ultimately, structurally, only serves the right and only ultimately structurally serves capital. I don't know about y'all, but I trust the people I grew up with, for example, who, like me, faced climate calamity during Sandy to know more about and be more urgently concerned with solutions to climate change than the CEO of ExxonMobil. I'm more concerned with our shared suffering and what, for example, what media conglomerate, Fox or CNN or MSNBC, might have captured your attention. And I think somewhere deep inside, many of us feel this too. I think deep down, we are feeling that the categories, the political categories that ultimately are excellent sort of devices for the profit strategy of the Fox Corporation and other media conglomerates, but I don't think accurately tell the story about the complexities of human people, that they are unsatisfactory categories. And there's a desire to break out of them. And we need a politics that could break out of them. I'm not interested in the flat binary liberal or progressive versus conservative, Republican versus Democrat debate. And I think when everyday people, like my parents, like my grandmother, like my cousins, like all of us, when we shift from subjects to these categories to agents of a new politics, something could really happen. And I saw it at that strike line. I saw it happen. That's why all of us are essential. That's why political vehicles and organizing vehicles like labor unions, like the Working Families Party, are essential. There's no force able to take on the work of organized capital other than organized labor, organized people. And we need more of these vehicles. Our job is to give our people an alternative story, a narrative that says we have control of our communities. We can collectively take the wheel without oppressing others and without fighting for crumbs. Our job is to meet the politics of cruelty with the politics of compassion, to meet the tactics of division the practice of the irresistible. If we can do that, if we could practice irresistibility, if we can build a multi-generational, multiracial coalition, we will take back our communities. We will build a deep and sacred and lasting connection from which we could deal with our problems, from which we could disagree lovingly, or sometimes not lovingly, but insist on connection. And take back our legislative bodies, our school boards, and our student governments and our federal government to use not as tools of redistributing cruelty, but as tools of being able to communicate fully, redistribute our shared compassion. And more importantly, transform our relationships and heal our aching, alienated hearts and build a why for resistance, for struggle, and for movement building. And this is ultimately how we free us. Thank you. Yes,
So that's really great. But can I push a little?
please.
One of the things that's often said about unions is that both that because people work together and because they share specific interests, it's easier to organize them and figure out a common goal. So while I totally agree that the UAW strike was amazing and fabulous, but it wasn't just that they recognized each other's needs, it's that they shared interests. So how do you build a sense of shared interests rather than just saying, okay, we all need to recognize we're all human, which I think is a really good idea. We can start there.
Yeah.
But how do you develop a common set of goals?
Sure, that's a wonderful question. And I want to say a few things. You're absolutely right. Just starting from a baseline of shared interest that still is really hard in the setting of a union to organize, right? Especially across difference. So I've organized over decades, and I've witnessed this in real life. I could give you countless stories of people identifying shared interests across difference. Like, there's one moment in my organizing history where we discovered that the local power authority was building a new power plant. And they were citing it. It's actually fascinating. They were citing it on this land that gave the corporation all these tax credits. And the reason they got the tax credits is like the land was near a zip code that was a socio-economically disadvantaged zip code. And in that zip code, there was a concentration of Black and Latino community. So in this weird, twisted way, this community was being the recipient of a intense polluter, right? And somehow this tax credit that was supposed to be like a economic engine was actually an engine for pollution, right? So for all those reasons, we're like, oh wow, this is like a story about the economy, a story about the environment, a story about racial justice, economic racism, and we want to organize this community and ensure that they're aware that that this power plant is being built close to them, and the reason it's being built close to them is specifically because of their economically underprivileged sort of position. And so we started organizing people in that community. And then we learned that just next door to them, there was a largely white community that was almost just as close to them. And so we started organizing those people. These are people who lived minutes away from each other, that had no contact with each other, that were, as different as possible. And initially bringing them into a room with each other was really complicated. Even expressing one of the central concerns as being a concern of environmental racism was really discomforting for some of the white residents. But we brought folks together, and that initial discomfort didn't go away immediately. But we had this real conversation about their shared issues. The fact that the wind doesn't observe racial categories, right? And the toxins will have a huge impact on everybody, adjusting this power plant. And so folks began to organize together, folks began to meet together, folks began to work together. Some folks began to like each other, not all of them. But what I saw was not this Pollyanna-ish thing where like all of a sudden, like I'm sure people who day one would have felt comfortable with, you know, this person's kid dating their kid probably felt that same discomfort like month two. But what I also saw was how I think sometimes we think these racial categories are insurmountable in in uh, in our ability to form real connections. And all we have to do is really try with intention and organize the conditions for people to be able to see one axis of commonality. And that's enough for people to come together. The other thing I would say is that I'm not one for focusing on our commonalities. I actually think that that is the wrong way of building solidarity. We're different. I think that that's actually interesting. And there's a way of acknowledging and elevating difference in a way that I think actually like could be a cause for curiosity. If you organize that, if you organize difference right, which was one of the reasons why I think organizing is a lost art. Good organizers can create the venue for difference to actually be a cause for curiosity and people to lean into one another. That's just one story. I could tell dozens and dozens of other organizing stories. Trust me, if working people, there is an axis of shared interest with working people if, as an organizer, you listen enough to find it. And often organizing is about listening in order to find shared interest, to bring people together, to have those authentic conversations where they realize the shared interest. And so my main point in all of this is that, and in some ways, it's like I'm resurrecting organizing because I feel like over the past few decades, I've seen how digital connection and like, you know, sort of virtual organizing and list building have taken and mobilization have filled a void that I think only organizing could truly fill, because it allows for people to reason on their own and draw those connections on their own, hold difference while actually not being moralized about why they should find solidarity, but authentically seeing the value in solidarity on their own.
So thank you so much. This was awesome and a really important message for us all to sit with, to not just recognize humanity, but humanize others in a deep sense and recognize where they are emotionally. So really appreciated all of that. My question for you has to do with the relationship between kind of more local forms of organizing and national, maybe even international, but let's stick with the national. And I'm curious to hear you say actually a little bit more about the Working Families Party and talk about how you scale some of these struggles, because the examples you gave are super compelling. And they're very much about people knowing each other, people cooking for each other, people taking the time to see that shared humanity, maybe also those shared interests. But I'm just wondering, I mean, to put it kind of provocatively,
Please.
Why do we need a national movement if where change is happening is actually within the labor movement, within local neighborhood, or say like city-based kinds of activist organizations?
Sure. Well, there's no place called national, right? So I often struggle around like, well, when we're talking about a national movement, what are we actually talking about, right? Everybody lives in a community. Ultimately, the value or the power of a movement should ultimately be measured in its command of actual people who live in an actual place and struggle around actual things, which is why I'm always skeptical about movements that are measured by like the scale of a list, for example, which doesn't necessarily measure the salience of actual people in a struggle and their willingness to take action. So the reason we need scale is that we need power, right? These aren't invented challenges. We have actual opponents that have actual power that could be materially assessed. And if we are interested in advancing our agenda, the solidarity agenda that I spoke about, we need to be serious about mounting enough power, enough actual capacity to be able to concretely win an election against a corporately backed opponent, right? Which is something that the WFP does. You need to raise some money, and you need people to do that. And so the why of scale is that you can't do that with vibes and moralizing, and which I see a lot of, right? It's like we should win because our position is the morally correct position, or our position is the factually correct position, right? All those things are good. Those, being grounded in like a set of morals or an ethic, or actually thinking things out, right? And believing that the policy prescription that you have would materially benefit people. But we also know that that's not necessary. Like you don't actually need to in order to build a move. I mean, look at Trump and build a wall, right? Like, is that a policy prescription that makes a lot of sense? No. Ultimately, the ultimate arbiter is power. And one of the definitions that I still use is like it's a combination of organized money and organized people. And one of the things that I want to caution us against, sometimes like we look at the vastness of the challenge or how hard it is to sort of scale and architect things. So we focus on the hyperlocal, focus on the small. And what I suggest is that you can't have a binary, it's either large scale or it's even connected. You have to figure out the nexus between connection and scale. And for me, that means focusing on leadership. So concretely, that I was just talking to somebody about this. Like right now, there's this huge peace movement that's taking place, and all these people are getting into motion. I was talking to one of the organizers, and this is a question that I face in the movement for Black lives. Like when these movement waves happen and people want to tap in, you want to create a venue where you're mobilizing millions and millions of people. But if all you do is focus on the scale, one of the things that you realize is like you'll turn around, and when the headlines are gone, when things are no longer like the beating heart or the major contradiction that people are wrestling with, those folks will go to the next thing, or they'll go back to their daily lives. And the thing that, as the ebbs and flows of movements sort of take place, the thing that I think organizers need to focus on is building leadership, building cadre. Those are the people who can be best in position in a place to, when there's a big whirlwind moment, to be able to absorb and to be able to help create conditions where many new people could draw lessons and could stay in motion and stay motivated. So concretely, the nexus of scale and connection, I think it arrives at that sweet spot of leadership, and identifying good leadership, investing in good leadership, and creating organizations that are legitimately democratic enough that people's leadership is actually needed. Does that make sense? Yes.
You mentioned climate change.
Yes.
And that is probably the biggest elephant in the room. It's coming. A few years ago, an author, Naomi Klein, was here, and she writes a lot about climate change. And one of the things that she stressed was that in order to confront the problems that we have with that, we have to have a new economic system.
Yes.
The one we have is it's driving us to the edge. And I was wondering, it really points to like a cooperative business model rather than corporate share owners.
Mm-hmm.
Make the workers responsible and make them owners. Mm-hmm. And they will do different things than a profit-driven or shareholders that have no part in the actual functioning of it. Do you see that as a way? Because a union is very close to what a cooperative is.
Yeah.
I mean, you're acting collectively in your own self-interest.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with Naomi Klein more, right? I think like if you want to understand, if there was going to be a neoliberal solution to climate change, it would have formed when the science around climate change was clear, and there could have been a gradual managerial class solution that could have taken place over those decades, right? That didn't happen. And so we have the system that failed us, and it's ill prepared now that we're in a crisis. And so we actually are in this crisis moment where there are like two possibilities. There could be some sort of eco-socialism, which is kind of what you're talking about, like transition to a regenerative economy, or there could be an eco-fascist strategy, right? That could also be a solution. So, one of the things I always remind people is that these are live questions and are organizing matter. And simply because the old systems have been discredited and there may be the sprouting of new systems, there is no inevitability that suggests that those new systems are going to be more democratic. How we're organizing and our activity and our ability to form a new consensus around what those new systems can be will determine that. There is a world where the right wing nationalists that are like in this country, the MAGA folks, and in other countries where they gain governing power and they decide how to resolve climate change. And climate calamity, ironically, will bring them the governing majority. Right? People desperately needing solutions, in that desperation, in that insecurity, might seek a powerful leader to do what the managerial neoliberals couldn't do. And so I agree with you. I agree with Naomi Klein. And I think that is a solution. That is, to me, an essential solution, but it's not an inevitable solution. And in order to fill that gap, we need to organize that solution.
I've got a question, and I also know that we've got a couple of questions in the chat as well. So we might bombard you with a few, but I'll ask my question
Sure.
first. That's okay. So I'm interested if you could talk a little bit more about what you think the relationship is between party and movement. And the reason I say that is that I loved your talk. I thought it's been really good, but it's focused, if you like, on building social movements, working class movements, and so on, as opposed to, say, winning elections, which often people who are working in a political party focus on. Now, there's a few ways that the left has traditionally thought about the relationship between parties and movements. One way is just if you work on elections, you're just taking good organizers out of where they should be and bringing them to the electoral arena, right? So it's just, that's one view. Another view might be a more synthesis-related approach. That is to say, by movements raising issues and working on issues, they are priming in voters' minds particular political issues, and that is amenable to the left. So you have a sort of synthesis between movement and party. And then, it was interesting you talked about building of cadre and so on within local areas who can lead movements when and where they emerge. That's almost closer, perhaps maybe, to a sort of more Leninist model. So that is to say that those within the party can go out and lead movements and so on. What would you say the role of the Working Families Party is right now, but also within the next 5 to 10 year period? How do you expand your organization, build your organization, and what relationships do you hope to develop with movements? And also, there's not one movement. There are a variety of movements you have to relate to specifically and so on. So that's my question, which is the relationship between the Working Families Party and building working class movements more broadly.
I'm going to answer this question. It's going to be a multi-part answer. Okay. You're a multi-part question. I'll give you a multi-part answer. Okay. So, all right. So let me talk a little bit about my trajectory, my organizing trajectory. And I think it might help understand how I even arrived at this place where I'm party. So I started doing hyper-local organizing on issues. I wasn't involved in electoral work. And through that work, one of the things I realized is that there were limitations to, and we built some really strong bases of people, but there were limitations to what we were able to do because there were just like political limitations. And that's why I got involved in electoral work on the local level, because I was like, well, we should change out these folks and then we'll have more political room if we could change who the mayor was or who the school board was or whatever. And so that same base that was focused on issues, we kind of electoralized that base. And then I electoralized and I understood the value, still the value of doing issue-based work, but having an electoral way and recognizing that that is access to electoral power is useful in advancing a collective issue-based agenda, right? One of the things I noticed through years and years of doing the electoral work was that there were real limitations. And the limitations, it's almost like a crisis of imagination. The limitations were really kind of like the limitations on the, it's almost like cliche to talk about the Overton window, but like whatever people thought was like the consensus idea of what was politically possible, that's really the space that politics operates in, right? And if you talk about stuff that's outside of that, you're not taken seriously as a political actor. You're considered like a gadfly and you can't really move things. Like maybe you could get elected, but you'll just be talking a different language with like the serious political actors that are living in this real sort of real world reality. So I realized that was a real limitation. And I stumbled upon movement building at a pretty high scale through the movement for Black Lives. And one of the things that I recognized social movements actually did pretty well was to scramble sort of like our idea of the politically possible, right? And pretty dramatically shift that window in ways that I was astonished by, because I was used to sort of sometimes the slow, hyper-local, issue-based work. And then with the movement for Black Lives, we created a real crisis for political leadership. This crisis was so intense that they started just throwing us concessions. Like I remember in St. Louis, they were just throwing out concessions and they were breaking hard and fast rules. They were like, oh, well, we'll just expunge the records of every single person in St. Louis County. I didn't even know you could do that. But apparently when you have a crisis that's intense enough for political leadership, because the important thing to realize is that like everything that is not grown organically is completely made up, right? Is right. And so like, like the filibuster, it's like, oh, we have the filibuster is just something that we made up, right? It's like, but in our day-to-day political realities, we look at it like this mountain that we have. It's just like this thing that a bunch of people decided is real. And as quickly, given the right crisis, we could decide it's not real, right? But the other thing that I realized is that there are limitations to the amazing work that social movements can do. Social movements at their best, I think, are able to surface contradictions that we live with, but are almost baked in. And so they render these contradictions, they render the invisible visible. And they often, when you're in the height of a social movement, it's almost like magic. They render the impossible possible. So things that everyday people just like don't think that they have the ability to do or other people have the ability to do. Inside a social movement, you're like, I could change the world. Like, I could actually do this. I could shift society. And if enough people do that, then it's almost like that collective sort of will actually shifts things. Now, the limitation is, so the social movement calls the question, the social movement surfaces the contradictions. Once these contradictions are ripe and they're surfaced, they almost must be resolved once these questions are called. And when they're called at the scale of the entire society, which means, like with Ferguson or right now with Gaza, it's on the front page, right? Everybody's talking about it. There must be an answer. It's calling for an answer. The social movement has the power to call the question. social movement doesn't necessarily have the power to answer the question. So with the movement for Black Lives, we posed a crisis, and we posed this question around the longstanding issues of anti-Black racism and state violence. And then in these moments of crisis, the most organized forces are able to resolve the crisis. And so the most organized forces under neoliberal capitalism is capital. So Taser International, it's like, oh, great, we have a product for that. And we're gonna we've already marked, we could just remarket it as a solution to this crisis that everybody's trying to find a solution for. And we have the capacity to, on the state, local, and federal level, be able to offer this to political actors as the solution, because they have a problem. They need a solution for this crisis. And it was this ready-made solution. And so now, body cameras are ubiquitous, but the underlying contradictions have not been resolved. Which brings me to how I got to the Working Families Party and the connection between movements and party. So we as everyday people don't have the command of the capacities, the immense capacities of organized capital, and we won't under this system. But in as much as we have anything that resembles a democracy, we can, through our independent strategies, have the command of the state if we take over the government, which is what political parties do, right? And so I got very interested in not just posing the questions through social movements, but answering the questions through governing. And so that is the relationship of a political party that has an associated social movement. Social movements do the leading thinking, do the leading imagining, do the groundbreaking, shift the quote unquote Overton window, push the boundaries of the possible. A associated political party concretizes those gains through governance. And that is the relationship that the WFP seeks to have, and increasingly has with our social movements. The Working Families Party, we're 25 years old. We are not thinking about the next election cycle as the main intervention, although we're concerned with the next election cycle. We're thinking about the next 25 years and how we build the infrastructure for independent politics across the country, so we could actually, by the next 25 years, or hopefully before that, build a legitimate third force in American politics. Right now, we've witnessed, so for example, the Republican Party. The Republican Party, back in the day, right? I'm sure you all might know this because, you're a bunch of really smart academics, but, back in the day when I asked people when Marx was alive, what American Party was Marx most aligned with, right? We're like, oh, I don't know. I was like, the Republican Party. That was the radical party of the time. That was the party I was like, yeah, we got to figure out these big questions. And some people in the Republican Party were really radical. And that same party has now become the conservative party, which shows that parties could migrate from one ideological sort of extreme to another. Parties can move, and the things that force them in one direction or another are these movement forces, are these poles. We've witnessed how, since for generations, there's been a white nationalist component of the Republican Party, but those white nationalists were not the leading driving edge of the Republican Party, and they didn't capture the base, but they have now, right? So we've witnessed how the white nationalist faction, just over the past few years, has become the leading faction in the Republican Party, which demonstrates the relationship between movements and party. And so our job, I think, are to build strong working class movements so that there could be a vital working people pole in our American politics. And the Working Families Party is committed to building a party infrastructure in and around that pole. So our future is three poles: the sort of white nationalist pole, this neoliberal pole that is at the center of the Democratic Party, even as progressives and leftists are part of the Democratic Party. I think I would argue that that leftists and progressives are not at the center of the Democratic Party. We seek to build a third force in American politics over the next 5 years, over the next decade. And that work has, for it to be real and sustained, has to be built with rigorous local, county by county, state by state infrastructure. I'm working with Corinne and Max on that project, their staff of the Wisconsin Working Families Party. And state by state, we're doing that in more than 20 states and counting.
So I have one question. It's the final question probably of the hour, and we're already getting to it, Maurice. So I really appreciate it. From Cynthia White, it's probably the perfect place to end, though it's really hard to overcome the last question and your fantastic answer. Cynthia writes, the question might be, how do you get the Working Family Party candidates on the ballot in every state, particularly here in Wisconsin? So she references the attempts made by Joel Rogers with the new party to do something similar, and it was very successful here in Dane County. But how do you go beyond that?
Yes. So we're making significant investments in Wisconsin. They're going to probably do some more of that right now. And if they were to stay, I would have spotlit them. But we're making investments in that organizing. We plan to have a long future in Wisconsin. We already have a storied history in Wisconsin. We've been here for several cycles. We've endorsed a number, Mandela Barnes was one of the folks who brought the Working Families Party to one of our founding members, and we spent a lot of effort to get him as close as we got him. And I think if things went a little bit different, if folks in the establishment had made investments, or we thought they could have made investments, we might have had a very different story there. And whoever that person is, please reach out to our organizers. Text WFP to 30403. They will find you. They will connect with you. It's happening. We have interest in an increasing number of states. Every year we're getting more and more interest. Like there's folks in Hawaii, which gives me an excuse to go there, who are interested in building the WFP. I just left Missouri, where we were talking to folks in St. Louis about building the WFP, talking to folks in Michigan about starting an organizing committee. So this is an ascendant moment for the Working Families Party. More and more people are seeking a type of politics outside of the two-party sort of binary. But I like to say that we're a non-delusional third party, right? We understand, we live in the world that everybody else lives in, where there's a rigid two-party system. And we've developed an organizing strategy that hacks the system as it is and seeks to long-term develop new structures in order to hold a different type of politics. So I invite everybody into that project here in Wisconsin. And for the people who are calling in virtually, wherever you're calling in from, happy to stay connected with you.